Mara lay sprawled in the dirt, her dress torn, blood seeping from the gash on her forehead as the last of the raiders galloped away, their laughter echoing through the canyon like a pack of wolves. The wagon was a heap of splintered wood and twisted metal. The horses gone, the supplies scattered across the rocky ground. Mara's husband lay 10 feet away, eyes open, staring at the sky, his chest a mass of blood and bullet holes. Mara tried to move, but her body refused, pain radiating through every inch of her as the world spun around her in dizzying circles. The last thing she remembered was the sound of her husband's screams as they dragged him from the wagon, the crunch of boots against gravel as they kicked her to the ground, the feel of her own blood dripping down her face as they took everything they wanted and left her for dead. Her throat was raw from screaming, her nails broken from clawing at the dirt, her eyes stinging with tears that refused to fall. How long had she been lying here? Hours? Days? The sun was sinking low in the sky, the light dimming, the shadows lengthening. If she didn't get up soon, the wolves would come. They could smell blood. They could smell death. And she was as good as dead. But then, above the ringing in her ears, she heard it, the creak of wagon wheels, the clop of hooves against rock. Mara's eyes fluttered open, her vision blurring as a figure appeared against the setting sun, a tall, broad-shouldered man seated atop a mule-drawn wagon. He pulled the reins, the wagon slowing to a stop, his silhouette framed by the fiery orange sky. "Hello?" His voice echoed, deep and rich, carrying across the canyon. "Anyone alive out here?" Mara tried to speak, tried to lift her hand, but all that came out was a weak, rasping moan. The man swung down from the wagon, his boots crunching against the dirt as he moved closer, his face coming into focus, a square jaw, thick beard, eyes dark and intense beneath a wide-brimmed hat. He knelt beside her, his brow furrowing as he took in the blood, the bruises, the mess of her tangled hair. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low, gentle. "Can you hear me?" Mara's lips trembled, her gaze drifting to the lifeless body of her husband, her throat constricting as a sob tore free. "Help me," she whispered, her voice breaking. The man's jaw clenched, his fists tightening at his sides. "Who did this to you?" he asked, his voice rough. Mara's eyelids fluttered, the world fading to black as the pain swallowed her whole. "Raiders," she whispered. "They took everything." Mara's eyes fluttered open, the world a blur of shifting light and shadow. The scent of smoke and damp wood filled her nose, and she was no longer lying on the ground, but wrapped in a rough woolen blanket. The steady creak of wagon wheels beneath her. The pain in her head pulsed in time with her heartbeat, each throb a fresh stab behind her eyes. She tried to sit up, but a firm hand pressed against her shoulder, holding her down. "Easy," the man said, his deep voice cutting through the fog in her mind. "You took a hell of a beating." Mara blinked, her gaze focusing on the man seated beside her, the merchant, the man who found her. He was tending to a small fire, his broad shoulders hunched, his jaw set in a grim line as he stirred a pot of something that smelled like beans and burnt coffee. "Where am I?" Mara croaked, her throat dry, her lips cracked. The man glanced over his shoulder, his eyes dark beneath the brim of his hat. "A few miles from where I found you," he said. "You were bleeding out in the dirt, and your husband—" Mara's chest constricted, the memory slamming into her like a fist, the raiders pulling her husband from the wagon, the gunshot echoing through the canyon, the look of terror in his eyes as they dragged him away. "He's dead," Mara whispered, her voice breaking. The man nodded, his jaw tightening. "I'm sorry." Mara's eyes stung, tears spilling over her bruised cheeks, her fingers digging into the rough blanket. "They killed him," she said, her breath hitching. "They took everything, the wagon, the horses. They took everything." The man set the spoon down, his fists clenching on his knees. "I saw what they did to your wagon," he said, his voice low, dangerous. "And I saw what they did to you." Mara swallowed, her pulse pounding. "Who are you?" The man's gaze darkened, his jaw working beneath the dark stubble. "Name's Jeb," he said. "Just a trader passing through." Mara's gaze dropped to the rifle propped up against the wagon's side, the barrel still crusted with dried blood. "Did you find them?" she asked, her voice a whisper. Jeb's jaw clenched, his eyes hardening. "Not yet," he said. "But I will." Mara's fingers trembled as she clutched the blanket, her breath coming in short, shallow bursts. "They left me for dead," she said, her voice shaking. "They laughed while they did it." Jeb's eyes flashed with something dark and deadly, his hands curling into fists. "They're raiders," he said. "Animals, and animals need to be put down." Mara shivered, the cold sinking into her bones, her eyes drifting to the darkening horizon. "Where are you taking me?" Jeb stood, his broad frame blocking out the fading light. "Fort Garrett," he said. 40 miles west." Mara's heart sank, the distance stretching out before her like a death march. "I can't make it," she said, her voice breaking. Jeb's jaw clenched, his eyes fierce. "Yes, you can," he said, his voice a low, steady growl. "Because I'm not letting you die out here, not after what they did." And then he turned, climbed back onto the wagon seat, and snapped the reins, the mules lurching forward as the wheels creaked and groaned, each mile taking them farther from the canyon, from the blood-soaked ground, from the place where Mara's husband lay dead and cold beneath the setting sun. The wagon rattled down the dusty trail, each bump sending fresh jolts of pain through Mara's battered body. The blanket scratched against her raw skin, her hands clutching it tight as she tried to hold herself together. Jeb sat at the front, his broad back rigid, his hands gripping the reins so hard his knuckles shone white. The sun was sinking fast, the sky a bleeding smear of red and purple, the shadows deepening with every passing minute. "How much farther?" Mara asked, her voice a rasp. Jeb didn't look back. "Still got 30 miles to Fort Garrett," he said, his jaw tight. "We'll stop when it's dark." Mara swallowed, her throat aching, her eyes drifting to the rifle propped beside Jeb's leg. "What did you mean back there?" she asked, her gaze fixed on the dark stains along the barrel. "When you said you'd find them." Jeb's shoulders stiffened, his jaw clenching. "I meant what I said," he muttered, his voice flat. "Men like that don't get to walk away." Mara's chest tightened, her mind flashing back to the canyon, to the men who had dragged her husband from the wagon, to the one with the jagged scar down his cheek, the one who had smiled as he kicked Mara in the ribs, as he tore her husband's ring from her finger. "You don't know them," she said, her voice shaking. "They're monsters. There were 4 of them, maybe more." Jeb's jaw twitched, his dark eyes fixed on the road ahead. "I know them," he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous rasp. "The one with the scar. His name's Harlan. He and his brothers have been running these roads for years, taking whatever they want, killing anyone who gets in their way." Mara's heart pounded, her hands tightening around the blanket. "They took my husband," she said, her voice breaking. "They dragged him away like he was nothing." Jeb's fists clenched around the reins, his jaw working. "I lost my wife to them," he said, his voice raw. 2 years ago, they raided our wagon, took everything, left me in the dirt with a bullet in my leg and her blood on my hands." Mara's breath caught, her pulse pounding in her ears. "Did you ever find them?" Jeb's eyes darkened, a muscle ticking in his jaw. "Not yet," he said, his voice hollow. "But I will." The wagon rolled to a stop, the mules snorting and pawing at the ground as Jeb climbed down, his boots hitting the dirt with a heavy thud. "Stay here," he said, grabbing the rifle and checking the barrel. "I'll get the fire going." Mara watched him go, his broad back silhouetted against the dying light, his shoulders hunched beneath the weight of grief and rage. Her gaze dropped to her hands, to the dirt beneath her nails, to the blood that still stained her skin, dried and cracked like old paint. "Jeb," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "What if they come back?" Jeb paused, his back to her, his head bowed. "Then they'll wish they hadn't," he said, his voice a low, lethal growl. And then he moved toward the trees, his rifle slung over his shoulder, his figure swallowed by the gathering dark. Mara sat beside the small fire, the flames casting flickering shadows across the rocky ground, her body wrapped tight in the blanket as she shivered against the cold. Jeb sat across from her, his jaw set, his eyes fixed on the dark woods beyond the circle of light. The rifle rested across his knees, his hands curled around the barrel, his fingers twitching as if he were ready to shoot at the first sign of movement. "You should eat," he said, nodding toward the tin cup he'd filled with beans and set beside her. Mara's stomach twisted, her throat too tight to swallow. "Not hungry," she muttered, her gaze dropping to the ground, to the blood and dirt still caked beneath her nails. Jeb's jaw clenched, his eyes darkening. "You need to keep your strength up," he said, his voice a low, steady rasp. "We've still got a long way to go." Mara swallowed, her pulse pounding as she stared into the flames, the images flashing through her mind like a waking nightmare. The raiders dragging her husband from the wagon, his screams echoing through the canyon, the crack of the gunshot that ended his life. "You said you know them," she said, her voice tight, her gaze locked on the fire. "The men who did this." Jeb's eyes narrowed, his jaw grinding. "Harlan and his brothers," he said, his voice dripping with venom. "They've been running these roads for years, stealing, killing, burning everything they touch." Mara's fists clenched in the blanket, her nails digging into the rough wool. "Why hasn't anyone stopped them?" Jeb's jaw twitched, his gaze dropping to the rifle. "Because no one's brave enough, or stupid enough." Mara swallowed, her throat raw, her heart hammering. "But you are?" Jeb's gaze met hers, his eyes cold and hard. "I've got nothing left to lose," he said, his voice flat. "Not anymore." Mara's chest tightened, the pain a sharp, twisting ache beneath her ribs. "I do," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I lost everything." Jeb's jaw clenched, his fists tightening around the rifle. "Not everything," he said, his eyes fierce. "You're still breathing. That means you've still got a chance to make them pay." Mara's breath hitched, her pulse pounding as the fire crackled between them, the flames casting eerie shadows across Jeb's scarred face. "I don't know how," she said, her voice trembling. "I don't know how to fight." Jeb leaned forward, his gaze boring into hers, his jaw set, his fists clenched. "You don't need to know how," he said, his voice a low, lethal rasp. "You just need to want it bad enough." Mara swallowed, her throat tight, her hands shaking. "I do," she said, her voice a broken whisper. "I want it more than anything." Jeb's gaze darkened, his jaw clenching as he nodded. "Then you hold on to that," he said, his voice rough. "Because when we get to Fort Garrett, I'm going to teach you how to use this." He lifted the rifle, his eyes flashing like dark, deadly fire. "And then we're going to find them." Mara's hands shook as she clutched the rifle, her fingers wrapped around the cold metal, the weight of it pressing down on her like a stone. Jeb stood behind her, his broad hands firm on her shoulders, his breath hot against her ear as he leaned in, his voice a low, steady murmur. "Steady," he said. "Keep your feet planted. Square your shoulders." Mara swallowed, her heart pounding so hard she could barely hear him over the roar of blood in her ears. They were still miles away from Fort Garrett, still too far from any place with walls and men who could keep them safe. But Jeb said she needed to learn now, said she needed to know how to protect herself, said she couldn't count on him to always be there to save her. "Now aim," Jeb said, his voice calm, controlled, like he was asking her to do something as simple as pour a cup of coffee. But this wasn't coffee, this was a rifle. This was life and death. Mara exhaled, her hands trembling as she lifted the gun, her gaze fixed on the empty tin can Jeb had set up 20 paces away. "Breathe in," Jeb said. "Hold it." Mara sucked in a breath, her lungs burning, her jaw clenched as she tried to steady the rifle, the barrel swaying beneath the weight of her fear. "Now," Jeb said, his voice dropping to a low, lethal rasp. "Squeeze the trigger." Mara's finger tightened around the trigger, and the rifle roared, the sound like thunder in her ears. The recoil slammed into her shoulder, knocking her back, the shot going wide, the tin can untouched. "Again," Jeb said, his eyes hard, his jaw set. "You're not leaving this spot until you hit it." Mara swallowed, her throat raw, her chest tight as she lifted the rifle again, her hands shaking, her knees trembling. "I can't," she said, her voice breaking. "I can't do it!" Jeb's jaw clenched, his fists curling at his sides. "You think those men care that you're scared?" He snapped, his voice sharp as a whip. "You think they're going to spare you because you're weak, because you're a woman, because you're crying?" Mara's breath hitched, tears stinging her eyes as the memory of her husband's blood-soaked body flashed through her mind, the sound of his screams echoing through her skull. "They killed my husband," she whispered, her voice shaking. "They dragged me out of the wagon and threw me to the ground. They laughed while they did it." Jeb stepped closer, his dark eyes boring into hers, his jaw tight, his breath a harsh rasp. "Then what are you going to do about it?" he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "Cry? Beg for mercy? Or are you going to make them pay?" Mara's jaw clenched, the tears burning her eyes, her heart slamming against her ribs. "I want them dead," she said, her voice a raw, guttural snarl. Jeb nodded, his eyes flashing with a dark, savage fire. "Then pick up the rifle," he said, "and don't stop shooting until you hit the damn can." Mara gritted her teeth, her hands shaking as she lifted the rifle, her gaze fixed on the tin can, her jaw set. And this time, when she pulled the trigger, the shot rang out, and the can flew through the air, a hole punched clean through the center. The fire crackled between them, the orange glow flickering against the night as Mara sat with the rifle resting across her knees, her fingers tracing the cold, hard barrel. Jeb leaned against the wagon wheel, his arms crossed over his chest, his dark eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the firelight. "You did good today," he said, his voice low, calm. "You're learning fast." Mara swallowed, her throat dry, her jaw tight. "I don't feel like I'm learning," she said, her voice a hollow rasp. "I feel like I'm falling apart." Jeb's jaw clenched, his gaze dropping to the ground. "Falling apart's part of it," he said, his voice edged with something dark, something bitter. "You think I wasn't a mess after they took my wife?" Mara's eyes lifted to his, the fire casting deep shadows across his scarred face, his jaw hard as granite. "What did they do to her?" she asked, her voice trembling. Jeb's fists clenched, the veins standing out against the skin of his forearms, his jaw grinding. "They dragged her from our wagon," he said, his voice raw, ragged. "Took her behind a barn. Said they'd let her go if I told them where the money was." Mara's heart pounded, her pulse a frantic beat in her ears. "Did you?" Jeb's eyes flashed, his teeth bared. "There was no money," he said, his voice sharp. "But they didn't believe me." He pushed away from the wagon, pacing the perimeter of the fire, his boots grinding against the dirt. "They killed her," he said, his voice dropping to a low, lethal rasp. "Left her there for me to find. Left me there with her blood on my hands." Mara's breath hitched, her chest tight, her fists clenched around the rifle. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice breaking. Jeb stopped, his back to her, his shoulders heaving as he sucked in a ragged breath. "Don't be," he said, "because I didn't stay down. I got back up, and now, every step I take, every mile I cross, is one step closer to finding them and making them pay." Mara swallowed, her throat raw, her heart aching. "Is that why you're helping me?" she asked, her voice small. "Because you see her in me?" Jeb turned, his dark eyes locking onto hers, his jaw clenched, his fists tight. "I see me in you," he said, his voice hard as steel. "You think you're dead already. You think you've got nothing left to live for, but you're wrong." Mara's breath caught, her hands trembling as she clutched the rifle. "What do I have left?" Jeb stepped closer, crouching in front of her, his eyes fierce, his jaw set. "You've got them," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "You've got their names, their faces, and the memory of what they did to you. And that's all you need to keep going." Mara's eyes burned, tears spilling over her cheeks, her chest heaving with the weight of her grief, her rage, her loss. "I want to make them pay," she said, her voice a raw, guttural snarl. Jeb's jaw clenched, his fists tightening. "Then you do exactly as I say," he said, his voice a low, lethal rasp. "And when we get to Fort Garrett, you make them regret the day they ever laid eyes on you." Mara's muscles ached as she sat in the back of the wagon, the rifle resting across her lap, the barrel cool against her bruised skin. The sun was a pale sliver above the horizon, casting long shadows across the rocky trail as Jeb urged the mules forward, his jaw set, his gaze fixed straight ahead. "How far to Fort Garrett?" Mara asked, her voice rough, the words scraping against her dry throat. 20 miles, Jeb said, his voice clipped, his eyes dark beneath the brim of his hat. "We should be there by nightfall." Mara nodded, her fingers tracing the wood grain of the rifle, her thoughts churning like a storm. The memory of that day wouldn't leave her. The screams, the gunshots, the way the raiders had laughed as they dragged her husband from the wagon and put a bullet in his head. The way they'd thrown her to the ground, stomped on her ribs, spat on her as she lay bleeding in the dirt. And now she was holding a rifle, sitting beside a man who looked like he hadn't slept in days, a man who was dragging her 40 miles to a fort where he promised she'd be safe. But what did safety even mean now? The wagon hit a bump, the wheels jarring against the rocks, and Mara's hand slipped, the rifle clattering to the floorboards. "Damn it," she muttered, reaching down to grab it, but Jeb's hand shot out, grabbing her wrist. "Careful," he said, his grip firm, his eyes locked onto hers. "You keep that rifle ready. You hear me?" Mara swallowed, her pulse pounding as she nodded, her gaze dropping to the ground. "I hear you." Jeb released her wrist, his jaw tight, his gaze shifting back to the trail. "They're out there," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rasp. "Watching, waiting." Mara's blood ran cold, her breath catching in her throat. "How do you know?" Jeb's jaw clenched, his fists tightening on the reins. "Because I would be." Mara's heart thudded, her fingers trembling as she gripped the rifle tighter, her eyes scanning the horizon, searching for movement, for shadows, for anything that didn't belong. "What do we do if they find us?" she asked, her voice a shaky whisper. Jeb's jaw ticked, his eyes darkening. "We don't wait for them to find us," he said, his voice dropping to a lethal growl. "We find them first." Mara swallowed, her pulse a frantic drumbeat in her ears. "What if there's too many?" Jeb's gaze flicked to her, his jaw set, his eyes cold as steel. "Doesn't matter," he said. "They already took everything from me, and I won't let them take you." Mara's breath hitched, her chest tight, her heart aching with a mix of fear and something else, something raw and desperate that clawed at her insides, threatening to tear her apart. "Why?" she whispered, the words slipping out before she could stop it. Jeb's jaw clenched, his gaze fixed on the trail, his knuckles white around the reins. "Because I couldn't save her," he said, his voice breaking. "But I can save you." The wind howled through the canyon, the sound echoing like a ghostly scream, and Mara tightened her grip on the rifle, her eyes fixed on the darkening horizon, waiting, watching, praying. The sun dipped low behind the mountains, casting the world in a crimson haze as the wagon rolled to a stop beneath a grove of twisted, gnarled trees. Jeb jumped down, his boots hitting the dirt with a heavy thud, his eyes scanning the horizon, jaw clenched, muscles tense. "We're stopping here," he said, his voice tight, his gaze darting to the darkening trail behind them. "We can't risk moving after dark." Mara swallowed, her throat dry, her fingers still wrapped around the rifle as she watched him pull a tin of beans from the wagon, his movements quick and jerky, his jaw set like stone. "You think they're close?" she asked, her voice a thin, shaky whisper. Jeb didn't answer. He crouched by the fire pit he'd dug, striking a match against his boot, the tiny flame flaring to life, his eyes reflecting the firelight as he lit the kindling. "I can feel them," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "Like wolves, circling, waiting to pounce." Mara's stomach twisted, her hands shaking as she hugged the rifle to her chest, her pulse hammering like a drum. What do we do? Jeb's jaw clenched, his eyes dark and cold as he watched the fire catch, the flames dancing against the night. We make them come to us, he said. We let them think we're asleep. We let them get close. Mara's eyes widened, her heart slamming against her ribs. And then? Jeb's gaze met hers, his eyes fierce, burning with a rage so intense it sent a chill racing down her spine. And then we finish it, he said, once and for all. Mara swallowed, the rifle heavy in her hands, the memory of Jeb's story echoing in her mind. The wife he couldn't save, the blood on his hands, the men who had taken everything from him and left him for dead. Are you sure you can do it? She asked, her voice trembling. Jeb's jaw tightened, his eyes never leaving hers. I can do it, he said, his voice a lethal whisper. The question is, can you? Mara's breath hitched, her chest tight, her fingers shaking as she glanced down at the rifle, the wood grain rough against her skin. I don't know, she said, her voice breaking. I've never killed a man before. Jeb's jaw clenched, his fists tightening as he pushed to his feet, his broad shoulders casting a shadow across her face. They killed your husband, he said, his voice cold, hard. They dragged him from that wagon and put a bullet in his head. You think they'll spare you? You think they'll let you walk away? Mara's chest heaved, her nails digging into the wood of the rifle, her eyes burning with unshed tears. No, she whispered, her voice a strangled sob. They won't. Jeb nodded, his jaw set, his eyes dark as coal. Then aim for the chest, he said, his voice a low, deadly rasp. And don't miss. And then he turned away, his back a wall of muscle and silence, his fists clenched as he moved to the edge of the camp, his eyes fixed on the trail, waiting, watching, the firelight casting long, twisted shadows against the trees. Mara lay flat on the ground behind the fallen log, her cheek pressed against the cold dirt, her heart hammering against her ribs as she clutched the rifle, her fingers slick with sweat. Jeb crouched beside her, his dark eyes narrowed, his jaw clenched, his gaze fixed on the trail that snaked through the trees. Stay low, he whispered, his breath hot against her ear. Don't move until I say. Mara swallowed, her throat tight, her pulse a frantic drumbeat in her ears. The air was thick, the night heavy, the silence broken only by the distant crack of a twig, the rustle of leaves, the soft, muffled sound of boots crunching against the dirt. They were close, too close. I see them, Jeb said, his voice a low, lethal rasp. 3 of them, just like before. Mara's chest tightened, her gaze darting to the trail where the shadows moved, shifting, growing larger, darker. And then she saw them. The men who had slaughtered her husband, the men who had dragged her from the wagon, kicked her in the ribs, spit in her face, left her for dead. Harlan led the pack, his scarred face twisted into a cruel grin, his rifle slung over his shoulder, his eyes scanning the darkness as he moved closer, closer. You sure this is the place? One of the men muttered, his voice low, anxious. I don't see anyone. Oh, she's here, Harlan said, his grin widening as he wiped a bead of sweat from his brow. I can smell her. Mara's blood ran cold, her grip tightening around the rifle, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. Now? She whispered, her voice barely a breath. Jeb's jaw clenched, his gaze locked on Harlan, his eyes dark as death. Not yet, he said, his voice a growl. Harlan stepped closer, his boots crushing a fallen branch, the crack echoing through the trees like a gunshot. Come on out, little girl, he called, his voice mocking, taunting. We just want to talk. The other men chuckled, their laughter sharp and cruel, their eyes darting through the shadows, their hands twitching toward their guns. Now? Mara whispered again, her voice shaking. Jeb's breath hissed through his teeth, his jaw clenched so tight it trembled. Wait, he said, his gaze locked on Harlan, his muscles coiled tight, ready to spring. Harlan stopped, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the dark, his grin fading, his hand dropping to the revolver at his hip. All right, he muttered, his tone shifting, hardening. You want to play games? Let's play. And then he lifted his gun, aimed it straight at the log where Mara and Jeb lay hidden. "Now!" Jeb roared, and the world erupted into chaos. The gunshot echoed through the woods like a thunderclap, the bullet whizzing past Mara's ear as she threw herself flat against the ground, her breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps. Jeb sprang to his feet, rifle aimed, eyes narrowed, his jaw clenched as he squeezed the trigger. The first man went down, a hole punched clean through his chest, his body collapsing like a rag doll. Harlan snarled, his face twisted in fury as he fired again, the bullet slamming into the log, splinters flying. "You think you can hide from me?" he roared, his eyes wild, his revolver smoking. "I'm going to skin you alive, girl." Mara's hands trembled around the rifle, her heart hammering, her mind spinning as she tried to remember what Jeb had taught her. Feet planted, breathe in, aim, squeeze the trigger. But her hands were shaking too hard, her eyes blurring with tears, her breath coming too fast as Harlan stepped closer, closer, his boots crunching against the dirt, his eyes fixed on her. "There you are," he sneered, his grin stretching wide, his teeth flashing white as he raised the gun, aiming it straight at her head. "Say goodbye, sweetheart." "Mara!" Jeb shouted, and she snapped out of it, her eyes locking onto Harlan, her jaw clenching, her hands tightening around the rifle. She squeezed the trigger, the recoil slamming into her shoulder, the sound deafening, the flash blinding. Harlan's grin faltered, his eyes widening, his body jerking back as the bullet caught him square in the chest. Blood blossomed across his shirt, dark and wet, his mouth opening and closing like a dying fish as he staggered backward, the gun slipping from his hand. "You!" he gasped, his knees buckling, his eyes rolling back as he hit the ground with a heavy thud, dust rising around him like a cloud. Mara's breath came in short, harsh bursts, her chest heaving, her arms shaking as she lowered the rifle, her ears ringing, her mind reeling. "Mara!" Jeb shouted again, and she spun around, her eyes darting to where he was grappling with a third man, their bodies a blur of fists and fury. Jeb slammed his fist into the man's jaw, the impact echoing like a gunshot, the man's head snapping back, blood spraying from his mouth. But the man was strong, bigger than Jeb, and he roared as he grabbed Jeb by the throat, slamming him against a tree, his hands squeezing, Jeb's face turning red as he struggled to breathe. "No!" Mara screamed, her hands fumbling with the rifle, her fingers shaking too hard to hold it steady. The man sneered, his eyes gleaming as he lifted Jeb higher, his boots scraping against the dirt, his legs kicking. "You should have stayed down, old man," the raider growled, his fists tightening, his muscles bulging. Jeb's eyes met Mara's, desperation flashing in their depths, his mouth moving but no words coming out. And then, without thinking, without breathing, without hesitating, Mara lifted the rifle, her jaw clenched, her teeth bared, her fingers squeezing the trigger. The bullet ripped through the air, slamming into the man's back, his body jerking, his mouth falling open in a silent scream as he released Jeb, his knees buckling, his eyes rolling back as he crumpled to the ground. Jeb collapsed against the tree, gasping for air, his chest heaving, his eyes glassy, his face streaked with blood and dirt. "Jeb!" Mara dropped the rifle, stumbling toward him, her knees hitting the ground as she grabbed his face, her hands shaking. "Are you okay? Are you hurt?" Jeb's eyes fluttered open, his jaw clenched, his breath rasping as he lifted a trembling hand, his fingers brushing against her cheek. "You did it," he said, his voice a raw, broken whisper. "You did it, Mara." Mara's chest heaved, her eyes burning as she leaned her forehead against his, her breath hitching, her tears spilling over, mixing with the blood and sweat and dirt that covered them both. "I did it," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I killed them." Jeb's jaw clenched, his eyes darkening, his hand still cupping her face. "And now," he said, his voice a low, lethal rasp, "we go to Fort Garrett and make damn sure no one ever tries to do it again."